While President Trump was parading military tanks through Washington, D.C. on his birthday, millions of Americans took to the streets in over 2,100 cities nationwide, declaring, "We're all kings, not him." This wasn't just another protest. This was a statement that shook the very foundations of American democracy. To see more fascinating content like this, smash the like button and subscribe, because what happened on June 14, 2025, will be remembered as one of the most significant displays of civil resistance in recent American history. The No Kings movement emerged as a direct response to what organizers described as President Trump's increasingly authoritarian policies and the militarization of our democracy. The protests were deliberately scheduled to coincide with Trump's military parade in Washington, D.C., which celebrated the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Army and conveniently fell on the president's birthday. The name itself carries profound meaning. By declaring "No Kings," protesters were harking back to America's revolutionary roots when colonists rejected the tyranny of King George III. The message was clear. America doesn't bow to kings, emperors, or dictators. Not then, not now. Organizers from a coalition including Public Citizen, the American Federation of Teachers, and the Communications Workers of America coordinated what they claimed was one of the largest coordinated protest movements in recent history. Lisa Gilbert, co-president of Public Citizen, explained that the demonstrations were designed to counter-program Trump's military display with a show of democratic resistance. The numbers are absolutely staggering. According to protest organizers, over 5 million people participated in No Kings demonstrations across more than 2,000 cities and towns. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to the entire population of Scotland, taking to the streets in a single day. Major cities saw extraordinary turnouts. Philadelphia alone recorded over 100,000 attendees, whilst Chicago drew 75,000 protesters. But perhaps most remarkably, the movement wasn't confined to traditional liberal strongholds. Small towns like Pentland saw significant gatherings, and even in Lewis County, New York, traditionally a Republican stronghold, residents organized demonstrations in Lowville. The diversity of locations tells a compelling story. From the bustling streets of New York's Fifth Avenue to the quieter roads of Largo, Florida, Americans from all walks of life felt compelled to make their voices heard. The protests spanned coast to coast, from Los Angeles to Boston, creating a tapestry of resistance that crossed geographical, cultural, and political boundaries. What made these protests particularly striking wasn't just their size, but their symbolism. In Los Angeles, protesters displayed a 20-foot-tall balloon depicting President Trump in a nappy, a not-so-subtle commentary on what they saw as childish behavior from the nation's leader. The signs and banners carried profound messages. Reuters documented 47 different protest signs that captured the mood of the day. Messages ranged from the patriotic to the pointed. Democracy, not monarchy. We the people. And America, where kings come to die. One particularly poignant sign read, "My ancestors didn't fight a revolution for this." The contrast couldn't have been starker. Whilst Trump presided over displays of military might in Washington, D.C., complete with tanks rolling through the nation's capital, millions of Americans exercised their constitutional right to peaceful protest. It was a masterclass in the difference between authoritarian spectacle and democratic expression. Perhaps most cleverly, protesters deliberately chose not to demonstrate in Washington, D.C. itself. This wasn't an oversight. It was strategic brilliance. By avoiding the Capitol, organizers ensured their message wouldn't be overshadowed by potential confrontations with military displays or heavy security presence. Instead, they created a distributed network of resistance that was impossible to ignore or suppress. Whilst Trump's parade was confined to a few streets in Washington, the No Kings protests painted the entire country in messages of democratic defiance. The timing was equally strategic. June 14th wasn't just Trump's birthday, it was Flag Day, a celebration of American democracy and freedom. By choosing this date, protesters reclaimed the narrative, transforming what might have been a day of presidential glorification into a nationwide celebration of democratic values. The human stories emerging from these protests were perhaps the most powerful element. Margot Ross from Watsonville, California, captured the sentiment of many when she told reporters, "I am completely terrified of what's going on in our country." Her words echoed the fears of millions who felt democracy itself was under threat. The protests drew people who had never before engaged in political activism. Teachers, nurses, veterans, students, and retirees all found common ground in their concern for democratic institutions. Many spoke of feeling compelled to act, describing the protests not as optional political expression, but as a patriotic duty. One veteran in Philadelphia explained, "I didn't serve my country to watch it become what I fought against." A teacher from Chicago added, "We're here because staying silent feels like complicity." These weren't professional protesters. They were ordinary Americans who felt extraordinary circumstances demanded their response. The No Kings protests didn't emerge in a vacuum. They capped a week of demonstrations against Trump's immigration policies that had begun in Los Angeles and spread nationwide. The military parade itself was seen by many as an inappropriate display of force, reminiscent of authoritarian regimes rather than democratic leadership. The juxtaposition was intentional and powerful. As the president showcased military hardware, citizens showcased the power of peaceful dissent. As he celebrated authority, they celebrated democracy. As he demonstrated force, they demonstrated the force of collective conscience. Despite the massive scale of the protests, reports indicate that the demonstrations remained largely peaceful. The Washington Post noted that relatively few disruptions were reported during protests and marches, where the mood ranged from joyful to defiant. In Los Angeles, there were some tensions when police used smoke devices to disperse crowds, but overall, the protests demonstrated the possibility of large-scale civil resistance without widespread violence or property damage. This peaceful nature strengthened the protesters' message and contrasted sharply with the militaristic displays in Washington. The No Kings protests join a long tradition of American civil resistance, from the Boston Tea Party to the Civil Rights Movement to the Women's March. But they also resonated globally, with international observers drawing parallels to democracy movements worldwide. The protests sent a message not just to American leaders, but to the world. American democracy, whilst challenged, remains vibrant and capable of self-correction. In an era where authoritarian movements are rising globally, the No Kings protests served as a beacon of democratic resistance. The No Kings protests of June 14, 2025, will be remembered as a defining moment in American democracy. When faced with what they perceived as authoritarian overreach, millions of Americans didn't retreat. They took to the streets. They didn't accept the narrative of military might making right. They created their own narrative of people power and democratic values. The contrast between Trump's military parade and the nationwide protests perfectly encapsulated the choice facing America, between the spectacle of authoritarian power and the substance of democratic participation. The protesters chose substance, choosing to be active citizens rather than passive subjects. What made these protests truly remarkable wasn't just their size or scope, but their spirit. They represented the best of American democratic tradition, the idea that power ultimately rests with the people, not with kings, emperors, or would-be authoritarians. In declaring "We're all kings, not him," protesters didn't just reject one man's authority, they affirmed their own. The legacy of the No Kings protests extends beyond any single day or any single issue. They demonstrated that American democracy, whilst fragile, remains resilient when citizens are willing to defend it. They showed that the spirit of 1776, the rejection of tyranny, and the embrace of self-governance still burns bright in the American heart. Thanks for watching. If you found this video fascinating, don't forget to smash the like button and subscribe for more engaging content exploring the moments that shape our democracy. Because understanding these pivotal moments isn't just about history, it's about protecting the future of democratic freedom for generations to come.